Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, I want to introduce our member in my group. First, Elka Putri as a presenter. Second, Yuli Rismawati as a presenter. Third, Dea Ayu Putri Pinuntun as a presenter. Fourth, Nikmatul Indar Abadiah as a presenter. 5. Jayanti Mandasari as a presenter. The last is Yucki Nurul Dwi S and Nauval Darmawan Dicki. It's me will be a moderator.
One, lingua franca. A lingua franca, it's pronounced ling and wa, fran and ka, is a language or mixture of language used as a medium of communication by people whose native language are different. It is from the Italian language, plus Frankish, and also known as a trade language, contact language, international language, and global language. The term English as a language franca is ELF, refers for the teaching, learning, and use of the English language as the common means of communication of speakers of different native language. Definition of lingua franca: where a language is widely used over a relatively large geographical area as a language of wider communication. It is known as a lingua franca, a common language, but one which is native only to some of its speakers. The term lingua franca itself is an extension of the use of the name of the original lingua franca, a medieval trending pidgin used in the Mediterranean region.
Okay, I want to explain about pidgin. In linguistics, a pidgin, pronounced pidgin, is a simplified form of speech formed out of one or more existing languages and used as a lingua franca by people who have no other language in common, also known as a pidgin language or an auxiliary language. English pidgins include Nigerian Pidgin English, Chinese Pidgin English, Hawaiian Pidgin English, Queensland Kanaka English, and Bislama, one of the official languages of the Pacific Island nation of Vanuatu. Okay, I will explain about Pidgin language clearly. That Pidgin language is a short communication tool used by two parties, individual or groups, who have two languages that do not understand each other.
In this slide, I would like to present about the observation of pidgin. There are 3 observations of pidgin, and 1. A pidgin says RL Taras and Peter Stockwell. It's nobody's mother tongue and it is not a real language at all. It has no elaborate grammar, it is very limited and what it can convey, and different people speak it differently. Still, for simple purposes, it does work, and often everybody in the area learns to handle it. This is from Dicki Concept 2007, Language and Linguistic. And 2. At first, a pidgin language has no native speakers and it used just for doing business with others with whom one shares the pidgin language and no other. In time, most pidgin language disappear as the pidgin-speaking community develops and one of its established languages becomes widely known and takes over the role of the pidgin as the lingua franca, or language of choice of those who don't share a native language. This is from Grover Hudson, Essential Introductory Linguistics, Blackwell, 2000. And the last is from Pidgin to Creole. A Creole comes into being when children are born into a pidgin speaking environment and acquire the pidgin as a first language. What we know about the history and origins of existing Creoles suggests that this may happen at any stage in the development of a pidgin. This is from Mark Sepa, Contact Languages, Pidgins and Creoles, Paragraph Macmillan, 1997. So next slide, please.
The next slide is the characteristic of pidgin. There are 8 the characteristic of pidgin. For the first is the most distinctive feature of pidgin is the lack of morphology. For the second is a pidgin based on variety X is not just an example of bad X as one might describe the unsuccessful attempt of an individual variant to learn X. This is because pidgin is developed by both sides of communication gap, as the main reason of creating this language is to help bridge the gap. Number 3. A pidgin is not simply the result of heavy borrowing from one variety into another, since there is no pre-existing variety into which items may be borrowed. It is reasonable to say this since pidgin are formed from some of their own language, some from other language. Number 4. A pidgin is language variety that arises from contact between 2 or more languages with complementary distribution. Number 5. In the context of European colonialism expansion, these languages were the languages of the European colonizers and non-European indigenous languages of those being colonized around the Atlantic, in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, West African languages. Number 6. Languages involved in the formation of Pidgin and Creoles are also referred to as superstrate and substrate. The dominant language in contact situation constitutes the superstrate. The indigenous non-European languages are the substrate, which is the less dominant language in a contact situation. The speakers of the substrate languages were regarded socially inferior to the European colonizers. The 7th characteristic of pidgin is the process in which a pidgin develops is referred to as pidginization. And the last character is a pidgin don't have native speakers. It is used as a consequence of the fact that it used only for communication between members of different communities. Thank you.
Okay, in this slide I want to explain about Creole language. A Creole language can be defined as a language that has come into existence at a point in time that can be established fairly precisely. Non-Creole languages are assumed, often in the absence of detailed knowledge of their precise development, to have emerged gradually. Creole languages are different from regular languages, so we can say that they appeared at some point in time. Applying historical Creole linguistic technique is therefore not simple, and in addition, it presupposes answering the question of which Creole language should be compared. The language that provides the lexicon or the language that is responsible for most aspect of grammatical structure as far as possible to identify this. So, pidgins have no native speakers. They arise because the need for a lingua franca. But if that language survives and becomes the native language of the next generation, then it is now a Creole language. Jadi itu pada intinya pidgin tidak mempunyai penutur asli. Mereka muncul karena kebutuhan untuk bahasa sehari-hari, bahasa perantara. Tapi jika bahasa itu tertahan dan menjadi bahasa asli generasi penerus, itu adalah yang disebut Creole language.
Okay, in this slide, I want to explain the characteristic of creoles. A creole is usually defined both with reference to and in contrast to pidgins. Here are the important defining features of Creole language. The first is Creole have native speakers. Unlike pidgins which have non-native speakers, Creole have native speakers. For example, a child born into a pidgin-speaking community will acquire this speech as a first language. Thus, the pidgin will be turned into a Creole by the process of nativization. And then the second is Creole always develop out of a pidgin. The third is the process whereby a Creole develops and a pidgin acquires native speakers is called creolization. And the fourth is creolization may occur at any the developmental stage of a pidgin. Depending on developmental stage at which creolization starts to happen, there is either gradual creolization or abrupt creolization. Gradual creolization occurs in the extend or expand pidgin stage. In other words, creolization starts at a stage where the pidgin is highly developed. It is already characterized by established linguistic norm of usage. Abrupt creolization describes the process before a stable pidgin could emerge. Here, the process of creolization occurred at an early developmental stage of the pidgin. At this point, it is still characterized by a lack of stable linguistic norm of usage.
The example of lingua franca. An example of a lingua franca is Malay or Indonesian in Southeast Asia. In this area, this language is used not only by its mother speaker, but by many second speakers as the language of instruction. Another example is English on the international stage.
Okay, in this slide, I will explain about the example of Pidgin and Creole language. For the first Pidgin. Pidgin is a meeting of two languages that do not understand each other from two different speech communities. So that Pidgin doesn't have rules for determining language because it is only for communication. Pidgin doesn't have a speech community or native speakers and doesn't have a certain area. For example, Pidgin language can appear in the border area between Cilacap and Banjar. Here there are two encounters between Sundanese and Banyumas Javanese, which they do not understand each other, so Pidgin is used. Okay, for the second is Creole language. It's a Pidgin language that has become vernacular based on the agreement of the Pidgin community, so that Creole already has certain grammar, vocabulary, lexical, and grammatical. It can also be said that when a Pidgin already has speech community, it becomes a Creole. For example, regarding the example of the Pidgin language above, the Pidgin language can become Creole when it already has speech community. For example, in one sub-district in Cilacap, namely Majenang, they use a mixed language between Javanese Banyumas and Sundanese, which can be called Creole. The Sandinese language used in this sub-district is Rock Sandinese because regionally it is still part of the Central Javanese language. So the Sandinese or Javanese language is known as the everyday language. Okay, for example, in the following conversation, you can see in this slide.
Okay, it's enough for our presentation. Thank you for attention. If you have any question, you can type your question in column comment. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
It's not for me to say